In the UK, the state opening of Parliament featured a change of line-up today as the Queen's speech was not delivered by Elizabeth II due to ongoing health issues. Instead, Prince Charles set out the government's agenda, reading out the laws it wants the House of Commons to approve. The opening of the 2022-23 parliamentary session is a chance for Prime Minister Boris Johnson to pinpoint his legislative priorities for the coming months. Here's more on some of the key issues from the Prince of Wales himself.
Her Majesty's government's priority is to grow and strengthen the economy and help ease the cost of living for families. Her Majesty's government will level up opportunity in all parts of the country and support more people into work. Her Majesty's ministers will continue to support the police to make the streets safer and fund the National Health Service to reduce the COVID backlogs.
Well, for more on events in Westminster, I'm joined now on the line by Professor John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Thanks very much for being with us, Mr. Curtice. We did hear today from the Conservatives about this levelling up agenda, as mentioned by the Prince of Wales there. Take us through what this translates to in terms of policy and how the British people are set to benefit.
Yes, this has long been one of the distinctive themes of this UK government, a theme that's linked to the fact that it gained much of its support for Brexit from the less well-off parts of England in particular. Essentially, it's about trying to improve the infrastructure of the UK economy, particularly beyond London, in the belief that doing so would help to improve productivity in the UK and help to grow the economy. And given that living standards in the UK, like much of the rest of the industrial world, is now in the midst of taking a severe hit because of the rise in inflation, that's now become an even more pressing agenda than when the government was first elected in 2019. So it includes things like legislation for its energy strategy, which will be much more emphasis on nuclear power, legislation on railways, actually primarily taking them back into public ownership, perhaps rather surprising for a Conservative government, to create what it calls a UK infrastructure bank designed to be able to help fund infrastructure developments, and also dealing with some of the particular problems of town centres where, as in lots of places, post-COVID, there are a lot of empty shop lots as people have moved to shopping online. So there are now going to be legislation taken to say that if a landlord has a shop left vacant for more than 12 months, then he's going to be required to rent it out to at least to somebody. So that's primarily what this government is trying to do, is trying to improve the economy of the country, particularly in the left affluent parts of the UK, through a variety of essentially supply-side measures to the economy.
Now, this speech comes as the UK is facing a cost of living crisis. As you mentioned, inflation is set to hit 10%, and the effects are being felt by households. In your view, which parts of the speech address this with serious concrete measures that will put more pounds in people's pockets?
The answer is that isn't really the direction in which the government is wanting to go, or certainly emphasised in the speech. Of course, the one thing you don't get in any Queen's speech is any intimation of what might be contained in the Finance Act, which is what implements the budget in the UK, and we won't know more about that until October. But certainly one of the interesting tensions that the UK government is now facing is that, of course, like many a government, it's spent an awful lot of money on keeping business afloat and stopping the labour market from experiencing very high levels of unemployment during the pandemic. But having now emerged out of that, this government at least is now wanting to return to being a rather more typically conservative, fiscally tight government. And it is saying, look, we cannot continue to increase public spending. In any event, if we're going to give people money, we want to do it through lower taxes rather than increased spending. And that's undoubtedly a tension the government now faces, because it does look as though for significant sections of the public, what the government has tried to do so far in dealing with the cost of living crisis, which has been some help with energy prices, which have gone up a great deal here, much more, for example, than in France. Many people feel that's been inadequate. The government actually last autumn had proposed a tax hike to try to fund the health service better in the wake of COVID, but it's had to reverse some of that, but there is still a tax hike. So the government has been facing a tension on this issue, which to some degree at least, it's going to have to convince public opinion that it isn't, many people in the public, I think, are expecting the government to try to help to deal with this crisis by putting more money into people's pockets in much the same way as it did over COVID. But that's not the direction on this crisis that this government is currently wanting to go in for the most part.
Now, we did hear a word on the UK's departure from the European Union in that speech. What are we seeing in terms of a post-Brexit strategy there?
Well, I think we're now beginning to see at least some promises that some of the flesh we put on the bones of the relatively hard Brexit agreement that the UK struck with the European Union, one that, of course, does not require the United Kingdom to keep to any of the rules of the EU single market. And we are now promised legislation, for example, to deregulate some of the EU rules that currently govern business, data protection, financial regulation, gene editing, so some modification of the current rules that stop genetic modification food going into the market, as well as also saying we're going to pass generic legislation that makes it easier for us to repeal EU laws that we've inherited and just simply taken into British law for the moment. So if indeed the government delivers on this, then really for the first time, we'll actually begin to see some of the regulations that govern the sale of goods and services in the United Kingdom begin to depart from those of the EU single market, as well as also implementing legislation to some of the free trade agreements that we've now begun to strike now that we're outside the European Union. Now, of course, this does then raise interesting questions about the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the basic, still unresolved issue of Brexit, which the Democratic Unionists, having lost first place in Northern Ireland in the elections last week, are basically saying we won't go back into government until this, what we regard as the unacceptable border down the Irish Sea, has been gotten rid of. Nothing specific in this Queen's speech on that issue, just a general commitment to maintain the integrity of the UK single market. But of course, the more the United Kingdom decides to depart from the rules of the single market, the greater the probability that the EU is going to want to ensure that there isn't leakage of goods across the Irish border into that single market. So we'll wait and see whether the government's objectives of trying to ameliorate the Northern Ireland Protocol while trying to take what it regards as the advantages of Brexit, whether those two objectives will prove to be compatible or not.
Indeed, I'm sure we'll be hearing about that in the coming days. Thank you very much, Professor John Curtice, speaking to us there, commenting on the state opening of Parliament in the UK.